Thanks so much. It's so nice to see so many, well, new faces, obviously. Thank you for taking time out of your morning, night, or afternoon, wherever you may be, to yeah, join in today. I hope it'll be a lively discussion. And also nice to see some familiar faces as well, like people that, because of the whole situation, we haven't seen each other in so long. So that's really great. And, I think then I'm going to like set it up. If you like, you'll be obliged to participate. Let's just put it like that. So there's a price to pay. Um, so thank you to Sepideh and For an Object for organizing this. Thanks, Dan, for the introduction. There's definitely some continuity with some of the former sessions. So for those of you who have been studying those threads quite clear. I was watching the last session with Zé Antonio G. Picaron and Lucas Likavchan, which definitely we're sort of in a similar network of dialogue. So it'll be, I think it's a nice complementary, hopefully, session. And yeah, just to say that because we're kind of in this study group session, I kind of took it literally and not a master class, as it were. So many of the readings that I propose to read are, I'm not going to be claiming some expertise in them, particularly the Magnani. If some of you had a chance to have a look at it, it's quite new material for me to think about abduction through his work. So if anyone has expertise in that or not, welcome your interventions and corrections. And yeah, I guess the only other thing I wanted to sort of make explicit is that because we're in this kind of interdisciplinary space and everyone's got various backgrounds, I think it would just be nice and generous if all of our interventions could kind of keep that valence in mind, right? Of like, no, so we don't get too nerdy into like hyper specialization, so that we try to keep it interesting and relevant for everyone who's decided to join in today. And so yeah, I think the loose plan of the day, of course, it's like subject to improvisation as we as the sort of vibe, if you can even have a vibe in a Zoom, but as the sort of vibe of the session goes. But I will subject you to a presentation for about 40 or 50 minutes just to outline a little bit of background on like where I'm coming from, and I apologize to colleagues who know my work. There may be some degree of repetition. I promise there is new material, but I just didn't really know about the composition of the group today, so I figured it kind of made sense to paint some broad brushstrokes of like where all of this is coming from and why, hopefully. Um, so yeah, and with that, I will jump over to sharing my screen, and then you can look at nicer images than my living room. So can I get like a little thumbs up if you can see my screen? Fabulous. Full screen now, professional, good, awesome. Okay, so yeah, so basically the title of the session, Localization in Counterfactual Worlds, it basically feeds into a broader research question about the relation or lack of relation between conceptual models and practices of inhabitation in the context of historical transformation. So this obviously clearly resonates with a lot of the discussions that have been taking place at For an Object and elsewhere on world making or world building. And while I think, obviously a lot of the discussion has been happening on a very high level, a very sort of abstract theoretical plane, but I sometimes like to, at least for myself as a kind of para academic, if you want, always try to remind myself of like why, even if it's a naive or simplistic way of like why those debates or questions are important. And in the case of the world making, it just seems that it's important to remind ourselves that basically, if there's going to be any sort of political commitments to better conditions of coexistence, we're implicitly addressing the problem of thinking and accessing worlds that are not yet concretely realized, right? So if we are to imagine betterment, right, we're talking about a world that does not yet concretely exist. And that's why I think, yeah, this kind of discussion on world making has obviously implicit sort of political program baked in. And for those familiar with Badiou, Alain Badiou, this is similar to his picture of the inexistent, um, which names conditions that are not absolutely without existence, but which exert a kind of minimal, near zero substantial purchase within given socio-political configurations. So the example he always uses is like, say, women's suffrage, right? It's not like you had to invent women in order for women to vote, but with regards to their ability to participate in a democratic legal structure, that right was inexistent before suffrage. So just to kind of give a clear example. So basically the session tonight is one angle on this problem of how to make other worlds that do not yet concretely exist intelligible and inhabitable. And because this question of how to witness other worlds takes place within the historical problem space of techno-social, geochemical, and economic entanglement, the site of this question takes on planetary dimensions. So while I've been thinking over the years quite a bit about the issue of localization within planetary dimensions, right, in order to contrast a kind of maybe unhelpful image that it just means sheer largesse, right? In order to contrast that, that's sort of the reason why I've been working on these problems of localization. But I've also just wanted to shout out a few recent interlocutors who have, in part formed part of the, have been partially influential in framing tonight's session in this way. And that is JP Caron, with whom I collaborated recently with regards to the question of localization and artistic practice. And we will touch upon that, right? Because a lot of the activities at Foreign Object are surrounding the discipline of art. As well as A.A. Kavia, thinking about the question of localization through computational frameworks. And I can give a little shout out or mention that he's got a book coming out called Logiciel for those interested in checking that out. Highly recommend it. Should be out soon. And additionally, parts of this talk were also indebted to thinking through the artistic approach of Fabien Giraud and Raphaël Siboni, from which parts of this presentation have fed into an essay on a forthcoming essay on their soon-to-be released film. So despite the proliferation and sometimes I think overly trusting celebration of the term entanglement, there are no ethical nor social commitments that directly arise from just the sheer recognition. So many entanglements, as I'm sure many of us have felt, are involuntary. For countless, they're even punitive and have nothing to do with anything resembling equity. So entanglement is a description and not a proposition. So if the planetary as a kind of structural model premised on entanglement is to influence the realm of practical or social political coordination, it is via its power not only to be described, but to catalyze thought itself. So for Isabel Stenger's thinking implies, quote, giving to the situation a virtual power without habit, this is an important one, without habit, where the relevant tools and our models for thinking are ones that can actualize this transformative power. So just to give a picture of how I'm using it to the positive integration of the planetary, I choose to give the name Planetarity in deference to Gayatri Spivak, which is to highlight the distinct yet indissociable relation between a general epistemic model of reality and concrete practices of inhabitation. That is between ways of doing and ways of understanding. So just to be clear, when I use the word planetarity, we're talking, it's basically a practice of worlding the planetary. So planetarity can be understood as the practicable domain of activity within and for planetary conditions. So it's the making of inhabitable worlds conditioned by planetary thought. So it's just to point out that while a lot of the discussion around the planetary is with necessary climate models, all sorts of different models, seems like a kind of common recognition on an epistemic level, but that does not directly translate into like modes of know-how of what we do in view of that epistemic diagnosis. So planetarity is a question of how to construct worlds for conditions of entanglement and how that entanglement underwrites possibility in conceptual and practical ways. So while existing globalized entanglement is the consequence of what Lewis Gordon calls Euromodernity, the cosmological disposition that sort of underwrites this technostructural complexification is driven by ontological simplification. So Euromodernity, as outlined by Lewis Gordon, some of you may know from the reading that we read, what his Euromodernity names is the homogenization of convictions, arguments, and worldviews such that, to quote, legitimately belong to the present and as a consequence the future is to be or become European in practice, end quote. So so correspondingly, Yuquay describes the erosion of diversity in the face of homogenizing operations, notably biodiversity, new diversity, or worldviews if you want, and technodiversity. And this is, of course, where this picture of, or with this homogeneity starts to become conflated with, universalism, right? Which is, for those of us committed to universalism, completely refuse the conflation between homogeneity and universalism. But it's what it gives it a bad name, a sense. So in other words, this given entangled world is premised on a ferocious simplification. What we can refer to as a flattened Earth cosmology, because it's predicated upon the diminishment of dimensionality. So if planetarity is the minimum in the minimum instance is the making of worlds commensurate with amplified dimensionality. Sorry, how do I change that? Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, I lost my. I can't change slides even after 2 years of pandemic. I can't like look at paper and change slides at the same time. Sorry. So if planetarity in the minimum instance is the making of worlds commensurate with the amplified dimensionality of coexistence implied by entanglement, a dehabituation of globalized cosmological flattening is required, such that affirming planetary forms of life becomes coterminous with the figuration of activity embedded within higher dimensional conditions. So more simply put, how does entanglement transform the way sites of activity are conceived? How does that transformation affect the organization of knowledge because said transformation coincides with altered conditions of positionality or situatedness, which affects agency or the way things are done in a world or the capacity to do things in a world, as well as accountability or the consequences of that activity. So I think there's some nice overlaps here for those that were, like I said, at the perspectivism and platforms, or platforms and perspectivism of Zé Antonio, maybe a couple weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken. I had the good opportunity to check out the recording, just because there was a nice way of framing of like how things are. A lot of the presentation, if I recall correctly, was surrounding this question of like how the platforms see and what modes of agency do they enable. So I think there's some nice kind of overlap there about the the way that this sort of techno-social structures shape the space of affordance for activity, such that questions of agency need to perhaps be reconsidered. What do we mean when we say agency today? So in providing a genealogical, so I just want to give like a very brief, too brief overview of like one thing who's important for me, because she's been very helpful in kind of describing a genealogy of how we got here, right? I think it's important to recognize that historical dimension. So basically, in providing this genealogical model that underwrites our present, Sylvia Wynter has emphasized the unprecedented character of this historical moment, insofar as this entanglement compels the unrealized abstraction of so-called humanity into concrete existence, because the planetary indexes an environment in common for the first time in human history. Right, so just more simply put, right, that doesn't mean that an environment in common doesn't mean that everyone lives in the same way. Absolutely not. The point is that there's a connection through common problems, essentially. She's in a lot of her writing, she's of course committed to, let's say, realizing the lost promise of humanism, if you want. I don't necessarily subscribe to that particular ambition. Nonetheless, I think her work in showing let's say, the emptiness of the humanist, the emptiness of the humanist claim, because it only held up a very particular Euro white cis male whatever referent we of humanity. So it was always a kind of incomplete project. And Sylvia Wynter, she works a lot through what she calls the sociogenic principle, which is an elaboration of Frantz Fanon's concept of sociogeny, and it grapples with the establishment and evolution of social systems as they instantiate these idealized human concepts that serve as a valence of orientation and a reference point through which to justify normative and epistemic ordering. So in her model, the figure of man, so for those familiar with Wynter, she has man 1 and man 2, are historically architected self-images, and it puts into motion a framework of reference endemic to particular historical paradigms. So she's really trying to think, she's really helpful in linking what those of you familiar with Foucault know as the episteme, alongside, let's say, Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions, right, or paradigm shifts in general. So the way that these sort of human self-images function, they're kind of like, a gravitational core around which a social system revolves. And it naturalizes a ground of positive self-reference for thought itself, right? And when I say positive self-reference, that is not a morally charged view of positive. That's not what it means. It just means that it's the way things are affirmed through that idealized figure. So, for example, concrete example, the development of Homo economicus as a 19th century liberal human ideal, right? That now serves as a kind of primary reference point through which to justify modes of decision, et cetera, et cetera. So the sociogenic principle names this feedback dynamic between social structures and the internalization and rehearsal of them, such that configurations of knowledge and the choosing of relevant problems, to put it in sort of Kuhnian terms, right? That's also a kind of freedom to choose the problem. confirm the so-called veracity of positive self-reference that is proper to a given historical paradigm. So the internalization of self-referential humanness established markers of deselection or inferiority and selection or superiority. So on the epistemic register, this is what Catherine McKittrick has aptly named as a problem of adaptive truths, right? And I'd like us to keep that in mind. This problem of adaptive truths, a lot of my work is really invested in how we can start developing non-adaptive perspectives, which hopefully will become more clear. So basically what she means by that, these are truths that affirm a given configuration of a world, including its structures for evaluating knowledge, and of course what would be a relevant problem to pursue even in the first place. As it, evaluating knowledge that concretely exists and the genres of humans who perform it as it is currently given. So although it's not exactly the same, I think Lewis Gordon's articulation of disciplinary decadence, as you may have read, it has some kind of echoes there as well, right? We know, so it's this kind of problem of how to think, his is a more, let's say, practical, something that we can experience every day as we do our disciplinary work. So basically, I think this adaptive truth problem is alive and well in this concept of disciplinary decadence, which Gordon describes as a sort of turning inwards of disciplines, resulting both in the failure to recognize disciplinary limits, right? So like overstating one's disciplinary purview, while fortifying self-referential enclosure. And this is secured through the sheer learning of terms or codes and repetition of methods belonging to a field. So disciplinary fields calibrate not only what we think or the content, but how we think or the method. And when it's petrified, enacts a quote, an absolute conception of disciplinary life. So while Gordon speculatively, and I think for those of us that, work in theory or whatever, I think we're familiar with, we've seen that quite a bit, right? That it's just, learning kind of gets skewed to, and frankly, a lot of institutional knowing incentivizes this picture of learning, right? Which is more about adapting oneself to the given codes of a field and rehearsing them without sensitivity to external, let's say, perturbations. So while Gordon speculatively postulates a kind of I feel a rather abstract, what he calls a teleological suspension of disciplinarity to overcome this problem of disciplinary decadence, Winter leans on what she calls an outer view to help catalyze the possibility of thinking from without these given referential frameworks. And what we can think of as a standpoint of non-adaptive intelligibility that I think, also echoes to some degree what Isabel Stenger, as you recall, the opening words of this talk, what she was referring to as a sort of dehabituated talk, right? Her distinction between mere recognition and thinking. So the question is how one may go about constructing such outer views. To be clear, these are not views from nowhere, right? We're not just calling in another sort of like positivist, godlike perspective again. They're not views from nowhere. They're not without a site, but are also not bound to the parochial conditions of the local present world configuration. And because today it is impossible to speak of this sociogenic principle, right, this sociogeny, as if it is separable from technical activities, it becomes crucial to add to Fanon's original assertion that besides phylogeny, ontogeny, and sociogeny, there also stands now technogeny. So when I use the word technogeny, it can be understood as sort of indexing this co-evolutionary intermediary through which organizations of human forms of life are enabled and capacities for activity in cognitive and material ways are transformed And this can be productive, it could be ambivalent, it can be destructive in, axiological or practically speaking, right? So for Alan Turing, especially for those who had the chance to read, for Alan Turing and his infamous paper on machinic intelligence, this was written in 1948, by the way. Intelligence in human and machinic forms is dependent on interference or stimuli, to put it more simply. So interference is what enables an unorganized machine, a machine. So this is a randomly constructed machine, not intended for any specific telos or purpose. It's what enables such an unorganized machine to become organized via learning. So interferences may be social, so this could be interhuman or animal communication, sensorial or visual or olfactory or audio stimuli, or substantive, right? This could be encounters with tool, stuff, like. So over time, interferences gradually establish a metastable state known as a configuration, such that future interferences are conditioned by the frameworks of the said metastable configuration, right? So we can link this back to the problem of adaptive truths, right? So this configuration establishes conceptual frames of reference that set the conditions of sensitivity and insensitivity to future interference. So there are two categories of interference at play in Turing's account. What he calls screwdriver interference. So this is like mechanical changes or physical transformations, right, to any sort of thinking entity. And paper interference. This is more like theoretical or informational, transformation via informational stimuli, if you want. So because all historical worlds generate stuff, identification and behavior that's coherent with their configuration, the artifacts, the stuff produced from those worlds, can be said to stand in adaptive relation to them. So interaction with adaptive artifacts conditions receptions to interference that confirm the settings of a given world, right? Your interactions with your iPhone are not giving you an outer view, let's say. it's in a standard sense. So interaction with these adaptive artifacts condition receptions to interference that confirm the settings of a given world, including the organization of thought that is proper to that configuration. So simply stated, adaptive artifacts enable the rehearsal of habits of thought belonging to a particular world and what can be seen from within it, right? Just like, if you're an archaeologist, you examine artifacts from, different regions, different histories, and when you start piecing them together, it starts to become possible to, not willy-nilly speculate on the possible social configuration from which those artifacts come, right? So artifacts not only serve as external evidence for a given world, but as Winter's account of socio-historical paradigm shows, the externalities of the social technical systems, imprints the neurochemistry of our brains, explicitly recognizing internal transformations of biochemical cognitive settings because of external interferences, for better and for worse. Right? It's in this way that there's a theory that the mind itself is a historical artifact, right? They're not even chemically uniform across time. So it's due to this internal-external feedback dynamic that she refutes picturing the human as a noun, casting us as praxis-based creatures, and therefore transformable as a result, hybrid bios, mythos, and logoi creatures for which she proposes this moniker called homo neurans. So narrative creatures whose storytelling not only contributes to valences of orientation for social arrangement, but also marks the very materiality of the human brain as a historical artifact. So like I said, this is There is even a proper theory of mind that goes by the artifactual mind thesis. Yet, because this narration alone doesn't really account for procedures of substantive narrative uptake or externalization, Winter's being human as practice can be given more procedural specificity, right? Like how does this capacity to kind of to have material consequences of narration, um, this can be given more procedural specificity through the lens of interference, such that we may be practically described as creatures of interference, namely as homo interfatio. So in the non-fictional domain, historical worlds are sustained by self-referential narration of completeness, through the establishment of a particular discursive configuration that Winter identifies as the grammar of regularities. And these, of course, orient the appraisal of what seen as good, natural, necessary, relevant, or possible. So considering that a grammar establishes a set of rules, we can diagram this as a sort of enclosure of thoughts given sort of game-like possibility space, that is scaffolded by this kind of metastable organization of a social machine, including the set of criteria, to rehearse this line, to choose problems, right? And I really want to hold on to that as a potential interesting point to discuss about, like, what is there some degree of freedom located in the capacity to choose problems? So, despite the fact that worlds are the operations of worlds, the self-referential operations of world, it works towards its self-sustaining. They're of course not absolutely static, right? We're not in the same world that we were in 20 years ago. So change can and does occur within them. However, worlds remain, generally entrenched so long as the degree of change is within the spectrum of a world's given possibility, or, game space or rule space, if you want. And this is what I like to think of as a compliant genre of possibility. Or we can put it in different words, relative discovery. So the enclosure of a historical world analogously coincides with a machinic and cognitive configuration that nurtures insensitivity to non-compliant interference, reinforcing a state of actual unlearning while perpetuating habitual organizations of purpose, meaning, value, and taxonomy. Essentially what I'm describing is a world and modes of cognition that are not updating, if you want. No commitment updates. So to clarify what I mean by localization, which in this talk is basically it's the process through which a world configuration encodes artifactual and informational encounters with interference. That's the kind of working definition that I'm playing with when I talk about localization. So the process through which a world configuration encodes artifactual and informational encounters. Essentially, localization is, in a way, the way you establish the degrees of sensitivity and insensitivity towards interference. And because localization operates in world-preserving ways, transiting outside the constraints of self-referential enclosure, or habituation, entails the construction and recognition of extra-local sites or configurations for situational embedding. So, how are we doing there? Does anyone want does anyone have a question, or should I just keep going? Good? Everyone alive? Okay. Hang on. Sorry, one sec. I'm getting lost in my paper here. Okay, so it's in response, right? So just to say, so basically the question is like, yeah, we need to kind of be able to think and position ourselves from the perspective of extra local sites in order to uh, generate the possibility of these outer views in a sense. So of course it's kind of in response to this question where inductive reasoning falls short, since there's no experiential, intellectual, nor dataset memories upon which to base predictive determinations from the configuration of another world, which constitutes its site that embeds thought, right? Just simply put, there's no memories available from a world that has not yet concretely been realized. So the genre of thought required to think from without the strict predeterminations of precedent is abduction, hypothesis generation, or thought in the mode of creative discovery. So of course, this has long been regarded as a kind of ineffable or utterly random, because it's talking about creativity essentially. Abductive reasoning has been, notably rekindled as a pragmatic problem in computational developments of AI. These developments have aided in, I think, casting a wider insight upon conceptions of inventive cognition, human and otherwise. So abduction, however, as Charles Peirce noted, is not an endgame of thought unto itself, right? Like it's not this willy-nilly speculation of anything goes. Like a leap into a capricious ideas, but is more of what he called an interrogative mood that ultimately summons inductive reasoning for comparative scrutiny, bringing distinct epistemic values into comparative relation. So as Lorenzo Magnani's work highlights, abduction serves as a sort of bridging concept in understanding the interplay, quote, between AI and philosophy, cognitive science, historical, temporal, and narrative reasoning, decision-making, legal reasoning, and emotional cognition, end quote. So I think here it's also worth noting we're talking about AI less as this kind of standalone machinic thing, but as a general mediator of disciplinary interference across a myriad of fields. So this may be another way to kind of imagine, give a sort of twist on what we may think of as AGI or artificial general intelligence, right? I mean, of course, it's a bit of a joke, but we're interested here in the way that through this interference of actual computational capacity for machine learning to some degree, how that provokes a wider space of interrogation for, the substrate of human cognition, animal cognition, chemical cognition, all these sorts of things. So in seeking to understand abduction, which is a question of how to justifiably think outside enclosures of givenness that condition thought, namely novelty, Magnani has outlined two modes of abduction that are mobilized via external representation. So this is what he calls theoretical abduction and manipulative abduction. So if we bring this back to Turing's framing and his genres of interference, we can say that manipulative abduction is to screwdriver interference as theoretical abduction is to paper types of interference. Both of which broadly correspond to the relation between knowing by doing or tinkering and knowing by proposition or conceptual models and thought experiments. So abductive integration allows for the discovery of, quote, margins of indeterminacy, to borrow the term for you Simondonians, in a world configuration projecting the semblance of completeness. And it's through these margins that sensitivities to interference can be cultivated. I think this is a really interesting problem for those working within the arts, for example, is like how to cultivate these kind of sensitivities to interference. We traffic in interference, and the question, are they adaptive modes of interference or are they non-adaptive? Like, well, how is that working? Which we'll talk about in a sec. So for Magnani, the possibility of integrative abduction is dependent on epistemic mediators, for which AI-driven model-based reasoning plays a crucial representational role. I mean, in his work, that's not my particular focus, but that's in his work. So more generally, models, as Badiou writes, are what enable thought through participation, where participation is understood as a mixture of the sensible and the intelligible. So this notion of participation in the context of art bears little resemblance to the incitement of, audiences to become active collaborators in a work, but is rather more nuanced, manifesting as the construction of sensorial conditions that embed the logics proper to the world of the artwork. So unlike the hard sciences that are, more or less disciplinarily bound to discovering the what isness of a world in greater resolution, regardless of their, often counterintuitive or fully inexperiential accounts, the domain of art possesses no such disciplinary constraints of fidelity to what is. So this point ought to give us pause in the face of what Amanda Beach has identified, quote unquote, epistemological project of criticality that subtends the self-narration of art as a discipline through which to reveal the what isness of forms of social dominance. This epistemological project not only entrenches the givenness of a what is condition of a world through referential reproduction, in the negative, of course, on a purely moral register, it also implicitly imposes a constraint upon thought as that which must be consistent with experiential fact. So despite the proliferation of claims to knowledge production that I'm sure lots of us have heard about over the years, but despite those claims to knowledge production in contemporary art that enact such a paradigmatic epistemic project, the consequence of this framework is a conflation between the fact of experience with what can be thought. Because experience is bound to what is given in the here and now, by aligning thought absolutely with the fact of experience, intelligibility is constricted to an enclosure of immediacy, and such constrictions that privilege immediacy do so at the cost of confusing what is phenomenologically local with procedural possibilities of localization. So normative entrenchment within such a paradigm rehearses a sense of capture within the present, reverberating with bell hooks observations that, quote, critique can become merely an expression of profound cynicism, which then works to sustain dominated culture, end quote. I think we can even take this further and say there's a whole economy of being critical, right? If you're an academic, you can come up with these wildly, and I'm not anti-critique, but I'm just saying there's a way that you can traffic in this doomsday telling, particularly around theorization of climate change, for example. So yeah, she's worried about how critique can actually work to sustain, even if not intentional, dominant culture. And this has become a sort of, I think this is fed into our field as a kind of disciplinary cynicism in a way. So in response to this cynical disposition, or what Beach has identified as the tragic dysfunctional function of art, the turn towards speculation would obviously seem to be a way out of this entrenchment, right, of the what isness of the world. However, when speculative thought is just unleashed in totally arbitrary ways, entirely divorced from what is and what was of material and historical specificity, a negligent leap ensues for the trivial gesture of merely manufacturing difference for the sake of difference, as Reza Negrestani put it. So if participation implies a mixture of the sensible, the experiential, and the intelligible, the thinkable, it is an activity transiting between empirical and speculative ways of thinking. So participation then marks the relation between speculation and critique, for which Nathan Brown has proposed a dialectical method of rationalist empiricism, a comparative pursuit of claim checking, quote, what must be thought, rationalism, or the capacity to think beyond the limits of experience, with what is the case, or empiricism. For Brown, critique or empiricism denotes a space of constraining thought to what is concretely sensible, whereas speculation or rationalism acts as a movement of extending thought beyond what is available to the senses. And by insisting on a movement between the two, neither mode can be upheld autonomously nor regarded as, quote, superior to one another's claims, end quote. So this also carries resonance with Badiou's assertion that, ideas would be nothing, quote, ideas would be nothing if they were incapable of being accessed from what is given in the sensible, end quote. So at work in this curious rational empiricism as a method is basically the ceaseless setting into relation of discrete epistemic values such that they can interfere with each other in mutually transformative and hopefully nourishing ways. So the conception of thought as dialectical interference occasions the overcoming of epistemological obstacles, as Brown points out, that have sort of plagued thinking. That is, when we are trapping thought in either this general or highly abstract mode, or when it is bound exclusively to an empirical material state. So, and I think this would be an important way to imagine this kind of the sensible and the intelligible when we start to think about the problem of, how does one see a structure, for example, right? The relation between insensible structure and the material organizational ramifications of structure, right? What are the tools? What are these epistemic mediators that we could be creating to witness these phenomena that are, more and more structuring our day-to-day lives in pretty, sometimes not very good ways. So the degree of transformation of mental models corresponds to the receptivity to recognize signals or alerts, as Ramo Amaro and Murad Khan have written, as that what underwrites this self-transformational opportunity for updating our mental models. So for the Simondonians out there, this is of course what he calls transduction. Of interest here is how model-based reasoning transforms the space of search, how it is productive of other sites or worlds through which to localize thought anew. In other words, generative of this outer view, right? Generative of a site to embed an outer view. So by transforming the space of search, new problems and knowledges can be discovered because the conditions and context of embedding inquiries are open for manipulation. So to recall Beach's statement of the normative expectation that, contemporary art makes us think, right, as the kind of justification for the field. The normative expectation that contemporary art makes us think is rather trivial without addressing how and what it makes us think, as well as where it makes us think from. So I think this where is far more elaborate than merely talking about the architectural or geographic, space of a museum or an outdoor whatever, but includes the normative, semantic, and axiological configurations of a world that constitute its site and embeds thinking agents. So sensitivity to interference is a minimum criteria for the possible transformation of a world. Under what conditions can given world configurations of insensitivity be suspended? How is it possible to localize conditions of otherworldly thought that are not absolutely beholden to the here and now of the local belonging to a given world configuration? In other words, how to localize speculative thought, which necessitates the construction of a world to embed it, and what are the consequences of this activity on an epistemological level, right? And I think this would be really interesting to talk about in this sort of to kind of follow up on some of Amanda Beach's work is about what are the consequences of the, what is arts epistemology? When we say, that contemporary arts involved in knowledge production, what is the quality of that knowledge? Like what is it about, how is it different than knowledge that may be generated from the a physics experiment, for example, and how do we make claims on that? So within the context of rational empiricism, fiction yields potency less by the fact it is a medium for storytelling, but because it affords the choosing of problems to mediate and elaborate, right? That's what I'm going to be claiming. I think that's like one really interesting power to consider art. It has the power to choose problems, or fiction in general. So it's through this hypothetical problem spaces that a comparative standpoint can be built, a frame of reference from without the givenness of a world that is no flippant escape, but the construction of what can be described as a non-adaptive world. So just because a non-adaptive world may not be realized in the here and now of a given historical world does not condemn them to utter speculative arbitrariness. On the contrary, the propositional frames of reference belonging to non-adaptive worlds take on ludic properties, where the game of participatory moment is driven by implicit or explicit rules mandating specific imaginings, right? A fiction doesn't mean that like anything can happen, right? It's a space of plausible, plausible causality, characterization, and so on. So a non-adaptive world comes into sensibility when and where fictional truths, as Kendall Walton calls them, can be made intelligible within its specific problem space. And not unlike scientific truths, these are not mere flights of random hypothesizing, but must be recognizable at a shared dimension, right? Like if we read a book, for example, if we read the same book, there's a kind of objective world of the fiction that allows us to come together and even have a discussion, right? I can't just be like inventing characters that were not mandated by the author, for example. So there is this kind of space of truth or even objectivity that is created through these fictions. So ludic localization for a non-adaptive world is dependent on what Walton calls principles of generation that orient or mandate imagination in a particular way. So these are, of course, less rigid than explicit rules by fiat, yet nonetheless made transparent to consciousness. These principles are rendered objective and sensible, in part by way of props or artifacts that furnish a world with shareable referentiality. So artifacts, so this is where I'd like to kind of imagine this proposition or this possibility that's been haunting me. Maybe you have some ideas, but this idea of creating artifacts from non-adaptive worlds, that they could function as a sort of material evidence for these fictional truths, enabling interference in an organizing way. So constitutive artifacts act as mediators for access to the particular grammar, right, or the structuring game space of non-adaptive worlds, where their archaeological staging contextualizes them as if manifest from a world independent of any imagination or experience of it, right? Lends it its objectivity. The as-if empiricism embodied by artistic artifacts operate as both evidence and invitation. At once, artifacts endow an other world with this so-called objective interference, constructing empirical access to what is the case, right, and evidence, while those same props invite speculative departure, or what must be thought, from the configuration or rules of the mandated world in question. In such an arrangement that brings rationalist and empirical modes of thinking into interference, cues can be found for the refiguring of epistemic considerations qua art beyond forms of thinking tethered to the what is the case of the status of a given world. The epistemic consequence of making anything at all is quite simply always a doing. It's always manipulative. And through the integration of this manipulative doing with the world for thought such activity may enable, to paraphrase Magnani, a redistribution of epistemological efforts to manage objects and information, end quote, that can neither be immediately externalized nor purely imagined eternally, can be diagrammed. So in such an epistemological schema, the agency of thought to unbind itself from a given world is bound to the necessity of thought's distributed proselytization via artifacts constructed from a counterfactual world. So that's it for me, and I will stop screen sharing. I hope that there was no internet glitches. Germany has very bad internet, Berlin in particular. But thank you for your attention. I know it's difficult to stare in a screen, so I appreciate it. Thanks.
This was very good. Thank you so much, Patricia.
But does anyone have any immediate like comments or objections or questions or what have you, or points of like dispute, you know, like happy to engage with any of your or questions, whatever you feel like. Ms. Beach.
Hi there. Hi, Patricia.
Hey, nice to see you.
It's really good to see you, and that was amazing. And there's so much in there, but I don't really have a question. I just kind of have some thoughts, and I don't know what you think about them. So I was really right at the beginning of your presentation. You talked about the kind of distinction. I think you were talking about the distinction. You went over it kind of quick. It wasn't like a concentrated thing, but I was struck by it. You talked about the distinction between description and proposition. And you talked about the way in which we might describe this world of entanglements, but it doesn't produce necessarily any grip upon this extra local condition that allows us to think about other possibilities. And I think that's really interesting because you later come back to this question of narrative in Sylvia Wynter and other people's work, and you talk about how narrative produces possibly modes of reorientation, and you talk right at the end about how narrative, in the sense that narrative produces fictions, it has the potential to produce objective wills as fictions that orientate us. So I kept thinking about the relationship. You made me think about this relationship between description and proposition again and again, and how we might, as many people in pragmatism have talked about for years and years, is that there isn't description, there's only redescription. And the very idea of description is always a redescription and not a description. And therefore, we have to consider that this kind of closer imbrication between redescription and proposition, possibly. So I don't really have anything like, let's say, critical to say about that, but you just made me think about this elision of proposition and description when I think about it through the lens of, say, neo-pragmatic philosophy, and how redescription, of course, ties us to the world of description, both in a disciplinary sense, but also in this kind of question of the kind of constraint of the empirical that you talk about. So it makes me wonder, like, as you get to the end of your paper and you talk about, I think you're implying it throughout, is how can the modality of thought be manifest as a space of living? In other words, if a non-adaptive world is resistant in some sense to the world we might know as given today in capital, how can we think about a non-adaptive world that has this quality of resistance, but also we can live in, like we can actually live in as people? What is it to live in it? What modality of life is possible in a world that is, let's say, imagined or guided by thought, right? That's if it is a fiction. And I guess, I'm tying together in a very loose way this methodology, the kind of complex relation of redescription and proposition in the space of fictionalizing. And like I say, I don't have an answer for this, but I just guess you're making me think about this issue of living, this issue of thinking, and the ways in which we kind of politically demand an outside, some other world, that because this world we find ourselves in, this everyday world, is not, let's say, possible for many people. It's not a life that's worth living, right? That's what I mean by possible. And then finally, I just want to say that I guess it's another point, but I'm trying to cram them all together so everyone else can talk. But finally, I just kept thinking of, is it necessary in your thinking, like, that we need to tell the difference? I think it might be that we need to tell the difference between the non-adaptive world and the adaptive world. If we are to produce a non-adaptive world that we can live in, will there ever be a tool by which we can say that this is the non-adaptive world? Will we ever be able to recognize that without some kind of transcendental or weird kind of metaphysical operation to navigate that difference, like the difference of real difference, as opposed to like semantic difference or, you know, adaptive difference? And do we require, if that is the case, require the discipline of history to do that, or another discipline? What discipline is kind of the go-to discipline, or the presupposed discipline, let's say, that would allow us to make that distinction? And, you know, for some people, of course, the discipline would be philosophy, but maybe not. That's why I'd mentioned history as another one. But yeah, it makes me wonder what kind of mechanism is required, that is or might be invited, that is not local, that is not extra local, but might demand some other externality, or demand for judgment, let's say, between these conditions, to even know what we have done, where we are. So yeah, sorry for trying to cram it all in, but yeah, I thought it was an amazing kind of description of the problem. And also, I think what you've done, Patricia, is really great, because it doesn't just leave us with a description of a problem, but possible solutions as well. So thank you so much.
No, I think I'm really grateful for your comments. To be very honest, I really struggle with that question of recognition. You know, like, it's been, and obviously there's not a definitive answer, but the question of, like, if you take the axiom of, like, Nelson Goodman, that, like, every you know, making is a remaking, you know what I mean? Well, then what is the threshold of, you know, adaptive remaking and, like, I don't know, non-adaptive remaking? If something is so radically different, is it even recognizable? Through which modes does it become, can it even enter the semantic space of human social forms? Is that important? So there's all those sorts of questions that are very much open, and I don't really have resolved. You know what I mean? These are, because I think they are real problems. And I mean, it was quite interesting when I was working with Sepideh's not here, or maybe he's here, I don't know, with JP Caron. We were working on a, like, weird video thing a few months ago, that was, like, let's say, an elaborate nerdy artist doing theory discussion, let's say. Yeah, so not an art video, definitely not an art video, but not a presentation either of talking heads. I'll leave it at that. But I think he had a really interesting way to frame it, because we were talking about it in the context of sound and, like, world making in sound. And one example that he was pointing to was the example of Stockhausen Hymnen, for example. So it's this really weird piece where it's, like, fucking around with national anthems. Extremely modernist, but the interesting observation that he had was that the way the piece was structured was such that it, like, kind of, like, gradually eases the audience into this new sensorium that would allow it to recognize what would, if it just started in this kind of completely unfamiliar musically speaking way. There would be no way to have trained. So that was to create the sensorial world through which these new sounds could be heard in the way, right? So like it wasn't just making the work, it was creating the progression of a world through which they could be understood. So it's like clear, and like 20 years later you could just probably make the piece, right? Do you know what I'm saying? Because you would have like created a world where there was a degree of semantic reference, etc., for doing that. So it was kind of, I just thought it was a really interesting way and a very concrete example. Obviously, it's so dangerous and inadequate to talk about, to just shift disciplines, right? Like when you speak about it in the context of one artist's vision and the world of work that they are in versus political transformation, I mean, you just cannot compare those two things. I would, I guess, the thing that I would maybe push back on is this, like, through which discipline has the best purchase to address those sorts of questions. I mean, I think that's where you're getting into like the disciplinary decadence problem that Lewis Gordon is like warning us. And it's just, you know, the overstatement, or even, and, you know, part of his thesis is, of course, like when you project that on fields that are not your own, right? Like how we were, I think like Giuseppe Longo does a good job of this, you know, when we were reading the Critique of Computational Reason, how when these new methods arrive, that, you know, many other fields are expecting a panacea in a way from this kind of like computational domain, and how it just wasn't the right type of method for certain, you know, like biological cancer research, etc. So there's also this way of almost deferring disciplinary accountability by seeking it in fields, you know, whether it's not just about inflating your own field, but it's also about imagining that it could emanate from a, you know, from somewhere else, for example, without, I think it's more the question of like, what do we need to do in our own sphere of capability, expertise, however, maybe expertise is stupid, but, you know, interest, capabilities, etc., to participate in that. Like, what would it mean for art to assume this as a problem and try to find ways to work on it? What would it mean for a philosopher to assume that as a problem space? Do you know what I mean? And kind of, so I think that's why I'm very keep emphasizing this idea of choosing problems, because I think like if you can kind of locate problems, then you can still have many different ways to address this kind of common problem. But the common problem acts as a kind of bridge between thoughts, between methods, between geographies, etc.
And can I just say one last thing about that problem thing, is that what struck me about that is, again, I can't help myself, but I just keep coming back to the kind of background of the ability to choose. So, you know, again, in a kind of, from a neo-pragmatic lens, I would say that the very idea that we pick our battles, let's say, you know, at the level of thought or politics or whatever, from the local to the general, we could say that of course, from that lens, it's not so much that we pick our battles, it's that only some are accessible to us. So, you know, it's not a matter of choice, it's actually a condition of our constraints in any particular bureaucratic world that we live in today. You know, we can say, well, what are my capacities in this moment? What are my resources? Have I got time to fight my boss at work about this when I have to do this other thing as well? And so, you know, when we look at it locally, it's not necessarily a choice. It's almost like the empirical dominates, I think, a lot. Mm-hmm. So for me, the question comes back to, in this question of choosing our battles or picking our problems, it's actually, well, how can this imbrication or the dialectical tensions between the empirical and the speculative be engaged at that level? in the very act of choosing, because, as I say, that often it's the empirical that dominates those choices, like the actual material resources and our kind of being tired in the moment, you know, the kind of actual physical limits that we have from our mind in the world. So that's what, you know, you kind of made me think of when you were talking about that, Patricia, which was really kind of interesting around this question of how to actually think this dialectic all the way down as opposed to at a certain point.
Mm-hmm. Right, in order to get over the, like, you know, false image of choosing problems if it's a supermarket with full shelves or something, right? Yeah, it's not a Coke and Pepsi thing. Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's really helpful. Thank you. Does anyone else have something they want to say?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, who are speaking?
I'll turn my camera on for a sec.
Oh, hey, Keith.
Great.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for that. Always jealous of your diagrams, being that it's an interest of mine too, but I don't make them. I just tend to think about them more. So maybe for me, it's just like a minimal point of contention here, or we'll see. We'll see what you think about it, right? Because it's a problem of like art's role in knowledge production. But I tend to sort of like be strident in the opinion, I suppose, or the perspective at least, that art doesn't produce knowledge. It just can't. This is like a junk thought, a myth of sort of modernism. I suppose if you're Medusian or something like this, then art produces truths, but truths themselves are not isomorphic with knowledge, right? It's rather a vector towards which, you know, something will have been true. And after that procedure at least runs its course, then knowledge is emerged from that, right? But this is also the problem of then, what is art actually thinking? What is art? Well, according to him, like it's a configuration, but configurations get saturated. And there's always the possibility, at least, that in times of uncertainty, you know, you can reactivate these configurations, right? In different ways. So I suppose then it's the question of like, what precisely is art doing if it's not producing knowledge? Is it forming models and configurations that enable us to re-articulate worlds, whether they be saturated or not, whether they're new, whether they're sort of formalizations of the world as it exists, which allow us to articulate the world in a different way, which then enables us to see possibilities for other kinds of worlds. So, I mean, I just kind of want to like throw that out there to see how, you know, how it is that you're really attempting to think what arts practices are within this this problem of knowledge production, because, you know, and it's a question of whether you think that art produces knowledge or not, and if it does, then under what conditions is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I share your skepticism on that front. I mean, I think was trying to understand it more of like I find that like concept of, in a way, the kind of thinking of art as a kind of a modeling instrument in a way. And in that way, it kind of acts more as a mediator. So it's what like incites this kind of participation that Badiou was, how he framed it, which is, I guess, more how I would say it, because I'm not really into, I don't really look to art as this kind of didactic space, that's for sure. So I don't know if that, I mean, I don't think we're so different. I guess I do feel more committed, similar to you, to say like to be more into the question, what does art do, and not really that interested in what is it. But at the same time, I still think there is some relationship to knowledge if you make claims on the like epistemic mediator. It's what kind of can enable some sort of it's what can enable certain types of thought that aren't given to us in a kind of everyday here and now. I mean, it's a little bit, I won't lie, it's a little Rancierian, But yeah, that's the short answer. I don't know what you you have a follow-up on to add, or tell us more about your because I think you've done a lot more thinking about this specifically than me. I haven't been really dedicating a lot of my thought to the field of art, if I'm honest, the last years.
Well, I don't necessarily have a follow. I mean, I don't have a solution or an answer to this, right? It's something that I'm thinking about alongside you. I think the problem for me right now is one of technique. So trying to think of TechNet as the something that should be aligned with how we are trying to describe what art does, because it is something that has been elided, I think, in the canon of discourse theory and criticism for at least 100 years. It hardly ever comes up, and it's only recently that there are other thinkers trying to sort of pursue this, right? Because everything else that has dominated the discourse has to do with aesthetics, institutional practices, et cetera, et cetera. But what are we really talking about? I mean, it's problem of what you're talking about in terms of the power of selecting problems, right? These are forms of manipulation within concrete situations, and this is a problem of technique. And so that involves all kinds of different sets of knowledges which are drawn from elsewhere. And I think this is one of art's real resources that other disciplines participate in, but don't necessarily share in the same way, which is something that I think would grant art a kind of leverage within the situation of knowledge production, without it necessarily having to perform the production of knowledge itself. So that's probably all I would want to just briefly say on that.
That's super helpful. Can I embarrass you though? If I think Keith a few years ago wrote a really elaborate piece. I think it's where you're starting to think about this. Is that right? I mean, it's like, I'm not saying it's the beginning, but it's a really in-depth piece where you are talking about the art techniques relationship. I think would you be embarrassed if I put the link in the chat?
A little bit, only because, I mean, you can go ahead and do it, but I think that I mean, for me looking back on that, it's a very it's confused even for me to try and read it. so I wouldn't want to submit anyone else to that, but of course, yes, that's where I was beginning to think about those problems, sure.
Okay, well, I'm gonna post it in. You just look away. I found it helpful. So anyway, it's free online, so it's not like I'm giving away a secret. So I will post that in the chat. Here we go. All right, so this will be for everyone. Yeah, so I just posted what I thought was a really helpful essay, diagramming horizons between art, technique, and the artifactual elaboration of mind that Keith, the gentleman who just intervened, wrote a few years ago. That's a really impressive piece for those interested in this question. That's a much more substantial approach than I can muster up. Zay, you wanted to say something?
Yeah.
Did I pronounce your name correctly, by the way?
Yeah, it's Zé. Yeah.
Zé.
Zé Antônio. Yeah. So first, I'm really happy with this opportunity. Very honored that you actually engage at some point with my own workshop here at For an Object, and glad that this space is enabling this kind of conversation. And I have two questions basically, which are related with this interface between left accelerationism, neo-rationalism, this whole field, and the field of perspectivism, ontological turn, etc. I tend to see your work as more to the side of left accelerationism, but it seems to me relatively compatible with perspectivism and this other side of the discussion. So my questions have to do with that. First, like you start one of the texts with this, like the first sentence is like every human lives in a world. And of course, this doesn't mean only humans live in a world, but even if that's what's implied, that would be compatible with perspectivism in the sense that you can say that beings that aren't human in our world may be human, and then they would have a world, and you wouldn't be saying that non-humans don't have a world, only that they're human in their own world. So I wanted to ask if you think of that in that way, like if you think if your way of navigating worlds includes this idea that non-humans such as animals or spirits or platforms may have their worlds, and if they might be human in their own worlds. And also, like specifically, like since technical objects seem to have an important role in like keeping these worlds together, I was thinking about this recent dialogue between Viveus de Castro and Yuk Hoi, in which it's kind of suggested that the place of technical objects might also vary with different worlds. So would you say that the same beings might appear as technical objects or not on different worlds? And the other question, and this is like, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, but at a certain point of your discussion, I get the impression that we might be starting from a kind of a presupposition that we are like currently sort of trapped in this like globe world of Euro-modernity, right? That this is kind of a world that has sort of sold itself as the established world for everyone at some point, and then this kind of enters into some kind of dialogue with like capitalist realism, and then the problem is like, how can we create sufficient internal friction to sort of escape this world and be able to speculate about other worlds? And my question is like, is that really a presupposition, like a starting point here? Because I tend to think that at least recently, we are more and more already like in this kind of planetary situation where there is an incongruence of worlds. Like we have a number X of different worlds which are already like coexisting in a kind of with external friction or trans world friction between them on a planetary level. So, you know, like I'm not sure that the globe, like the Euro modern globe, is that omnipresent anymore. And then I don't know whether you agree with that, and what kind of consequence do you think that would have? Because I feel it might have consequences in terms of how we go about the problem of navigating these different worlds. Yeah, that was it. Thanks.
No, really, really interesting comments. I think like, I mean, I guess what I did let me just start with saying what I did appreciate, what I think I didn't feel totally satisfied as a result, but I think it's I really support the ambition, was to like, the question that seemed implicit in your presentation was like, how do you basically support or underwrite perspectivism without falling into trivial relativism? That was like one, and I think this is a real issue. And there's always this kind of threshold, right? Because there's like, I mean, I know the kind of, if we look at like, say, like Bratton's attacks on like Latour for saying like, yeah, we literally don't live in the same world. I mean, I agree. I don't want to concede. I mean, I'm not willing to concede the perspectivism so much to like take it to a point of absolute nonsense, right? Like, no, it's not a flat earth. Like, no, there's limits, right? So there is, to me, some need for there to be a position that is like oriented towards a kind of, the real, essentially, political realism in that sense, but like to the real, right? There's like a world that is going to do things regardless of what we think about it. Um, so on that position, like I think that's a really admirable question, because it's like I think we've been I think how it's been set up right now is basically that like the Euro modern view is the one that is the closest to the real, because there's all this like methods and sanctioned like ways to get closer to reality and so on and so forth. But that's a completely homogenizing mechanism, right? And so that is like that's the issue. So it is just like how do you then develop ways to um, evaluate these kind of like relationships to reality, manifest through different worlds, manifest through these different perspectives, again, without falling into just trivial relativism, because that's what I was trying to get at with the point of the negligent leap of speculation. Like, yeah, I can invent a world of unicorns and walking whales, but it's not really, that helpful in our problem space at the moment. You know what I mean? So like what is that relationship? And I think, I mean, I don't really have an answer, but there was one thing that really struck with me from your presentation, that I feel you're kind of you're trying to look, I'm like looking to you for the answer, and you're trying to like pick at me for some kind of similar answer. um, um, but the question, then the next question is, okay, if we, so it's basically like perspectivism with respect to the real, right? Not willy-nilly. Um, and I think like this is like, I guess, one thing that I think I definitely want to do more work and or more reading of figures like Lewis Gordon and people like this, like his kind of concept of geography of reason, right? Like I also really hate, and part of the xenofeminist project was in a way to kind of like um, you know it's like you have to kind of, you can't like cede reason to like the way it's historically been dominated, as if no one else has these kinds of capacities to reason, and reason happens in a multitude of ways through multiple devices, and so I really appreciate his expression, these like geographies of reason, right, where you start to, I think it's much more interesting to look at like the kind of history of human thought, how, what happens precisely when things interfere, right? When there's these like cross pollinations of thought. Like think about the discipline of mathematics. It's like, if anyone that would say it's a Eurocentric field is like, it's crazy, because it's like it doesn't even come from here, for instance, or the zero, these inventions that are like really important contributions to the history of human thought. So I think it's obviously a problem of the concentration, right? And that's something that he talks about in the article, the concentration of knowledge to this particular way of knowing. And it's just kind of, it's limiting the possibility space of like what could be thought otherwise. And it's basically reducing the possibility of interference is what it's doing, if you want to put it back into these like Turing terms. The smoother the space you create artificially, the less possibility of interference that you have. It's smoother, but you don't learn necessarily from it. I don't know if that like, was that a clever way to not answer you?
Yeah, I mean, I see there's like a broader answer there. I feel to like this interface between those different positions, but in terms of like, I don't know if I should like insist about like the question of whether like whether there's space for like different worlds in like the planetary configuration today. And I mean that, like, for example, whether different platforms or different governance systems or different like cosmotechnics, as Yukoi says, or, um, or even like ways of life which might not have yet been entirely penetrated by modernity. But I don't mean like just those, like not just necessarily small local stuff, but like just the fact that the world has become like somehow multipolar again, and that we are like outside of like the end of history situation of, you know, globalization as a kind of a non-contested nomos of the earth, right? Like whether there's space for a conflict of worlds on the planetary level, and then whether like whether the place of having a world and being a human that has a world might be occupied, at least like maybe even speculatively, by other than human entities, right?
Mm. No, definitely. I mean, I think this kind of, for sure, on the question. I mean, like when I say, you know, when you quoted that opening line, you know, like every human lives in a world, that doesn't mean that worlds are composed only of humans, right? um, it's because I think you made a comment too, would be like when you said like, would these figures in from the context of their own world, would they also be humans? And I was like, well, why would they need to adopt that form? I guess is like one lingering yeah, one lingering question from like your earlier you said earlier. um yeah, I think like, I mean, I have to do more thinking on this. I think like there's I mean, maybe I can just say something more um intuitive for the moment. You know, I'm not a philosopher, so there's sometimes I just like have some kind of commitment, and this is what I do. But it's just like I've been talking for a few years now about these like big world situatedness or planetary dimensionality, et cetera, and just like asking in an everyday level, like what does that mean concretely? Like, how do I need to educate myself? And certainly that is about trying as best as you can to you know, inform yourself about the history of knowledge in different regions, because you actually realize if you commit to that perspective, then you also have to realize the like the poverty of a single perspective. And there's also a kind of, to be honest, there can be this when you come from like an Anglo background and the entire world orients towards your linguistic predisposition. The region of the world where I'm from is where all these like bastions of institutional knowing are located. Um, you have a very sheltered grasp on the world, despite the fact that I think that despite the fact that it seems that everything has to bend towards the world that your group represents, there's actually a deep impoverishment of access to other things that come as a result of everything having to bend to you. And so that's what I can just say is like, I think that for me, that manifests in a commitment to, again, as best as you can, because there are real linguistic impediments, try to, you know, educate yourself about the history of human thought, about you know, different disciplines, right? How to you know, what does it mean to kind of mediate responsibly across disciplines without just like borrowing words that we like and then having no fidelity to their context, you know what I mean? So there's like, how do these processes of transits work? So I think that's like where I would say it's not a sufficient answer to the grandiose and very important question you have, but I'm just trying to explain how that manifests in a very rudimentary everyday level, by having at least a commitment to this like big world perspective in a sense.
Thanks. I didn't mean it at all like a kind of suspicion or anything like that. It's just like really a curiosity, like a philosophical question, really. Like,
Yeah, and there's I mean, there's also these kind of, yeah, I mean, it's always so difficult because there's, on the one hand, it sounds like by, you know, idea the worst way, right? The way that, say, like, certain certain ideas can be, like, used for nationalist interests, and even though the author of those ideas, it's like totally not their intention. Um, because there is always this, especially now in our climate where there is a rise of nationalism, right? And ethno-nationalism. So there is some obsession with some idea of the local manifesting in very dubious, evil ways versus other ideas of the local, or that's why I insist on localization rather than local, that are hopefully about trying to work towards understanding what betterment could be and participating in that discussion. Maybe I'll give Conrad the mic because you've had your hand up for a while. I'm like long-winded, so take it over.
My digital and figurative hand. Thank you so much, Patricia. That was really nice. No less so for the fact that it mentioned my own work in the valuation of necessity, which I discovered today and was pleased with. No, I guess the question I had, and thank you for these texts. I've never read this this piece by Turing, for example, in spite of it having been rattled off or cited manillion times in my life. So it was interesting to go through that. But I guess the question I have has to do with Lewis Gordon.
Yeah.
That's his name, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And I was reading through that, and I guess what I struggled with and what I wanted to ask you about was that he draws this contrast. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but he draws this contrast between rationality and reason, right? And he portrays, rationality as being, related to the generation of maximal consistency, particularly through the use of laws, and he relates it to the character of the sciences in general. And then he talks about how reason, as a more general heuristic, could be seen as a potential antidote, right, to the linearizing dimension of this. And I guess what I think, and maybe this will be a bit dense to get into, but I guess I wonder if that's a fair characterization of science. I see you shaking your head, so maybe we're going in the same direction here anyway. But because it seems to me that, like, to talk about, as he does, like universal laws being characteristic of rationality, I mean, it's like we're not in the scientific age of like Galileo and Newton. So I think that's changed quite a bit. You could look at things like post-Newtonian physics, which are many things, but I don't think they're prepossessed by laws as we think of it in that way. So I wonder if that's quite a modernistic image of science. But also, I would think that the virtue of science, in many ways, is that it disrupts this sort of rationalistic pretension, if you will. And this is something I know this is going to be contentious.
In an ideal sense, right? But like, yeah. I mean,
Well,
Mike, can I just like intervene quickly because I think I have
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Because I share the doubts. I do appreciate, because I have always struggled with the rationality. I don't like this word. I'm like a reason girl.
Okay.
And so of course I appreciated when Gordon like substantiates, but at the same time it's a caricature, because essentially what he's illustrating, or what the kind of metaphoric analogy that you find in like the domain of computing is like the paperclip maximizer thought experiment, right? So like the AI just has this, it wants to turn everything into a paperclip in the world, down to the fact that it'll eat the globe. It won't know when to stop, when's enough, right? So it doesn't possess reason to know when to have this limit. So essentially it strikes me that his picturing of rationality as this just like consistency maximizing, follow the recipe sort of thing, is analogous to that metaphor, but is also like, I think this is where it gets more interesting if you talk about, I agree with his characterization of the disciplines. This I see every day happening in my field everywhere, right? And we all know it.
Yeah.
We're part of it in a way, right? But okay, so how do we become aware of it? I'm not really on board with the characterization of science. I don't think you can just. I appreciate the fact that he's not saying science is a European enterprise. I mean, I think this is correct. I think somebody like more the stakes of reason or rationality in scientific work today, where she's like talking that it's less about, you know, the discovery, but they have to invent objects of interrogation. So basically the job of, you know, to put it in a really nutshell way, like the type of epistemology she's talking about is the one that has to invent objects of inquiry, not discover the thing. Right? Anyway, so sorry to interrupt, but go on.
No, I think that's all quite related. But I guess, you know, not to suggest that science, you know, can't get, you know, stuck going through sort of dead ends and blind alleys. But I just mean that, you know, I mean, I think one of my favorite thing about science actually is probably, there's a beautiful passage. It's the appendix to Louis Althusser's Contradiction over Determination. And what he says is that, you know, if you were to chase the scientific method to, you know, its logical end, or to try to explain it philosophically, it would always collapse into what he calls an epistemological void. Because at the end of the day, like, there's a presupposition of ontological objects, there's a presupposition that things exist, which, you know, I think if you look at philosophy with its more logicist character, I think it tends to produce idealist conclusions, right? Because, like, you know, if you really try to chase these epistemological questions to the bottom, you're kind of left with these irresolvable aporias, right? How do we actually get beyond our perception, you know, and this sort of thing. But I guess like what this raises, I think, maybe a bigger question, which just has to do with, you know, like even the sort of contrast he establishes between rationality and reason. And I wonder if we can really look to, even equivocally, because I know, like, I'm not, you know, I know you've talked a lot about like situated reason and things like this, but I wonder if we can look to reason in that way as the solution. And I want to suggest that I think the risk of that is, I think that usually when people, particularly when they try to draw a distinction between a more general conception of reason and the specificity of scientific reasoning, it tends to have to do with the assertion of the privilege of logic over science, which is to say philosophy. So if you read someone like, you know, Brandom or something like that, right? It's like, you know, you have this sort of pragmatic, semantic pragmatics, like inferentialism. It's actually very interesting, like if you read Brandom, because, like, you know, there's a problem even with how he deals with reliabism, because he denies all like representationalism to such a point that he actually can't include really any process of causal, you know, redescription within his own work. So it's actually very unscientific and even anti-scientific, I would say. I would say it's like a hyper logicistic sort of thing. And then it's interesting that that sort of battle is fought on the grounds of the need to revive Hegelianism, right? Which is obviously, you know, very, and complicatedly, I have to admit, connected with this conception of maybe a sort of vexed or obstructed telos of reason. You know, I just wonder about these things, because I wonder if you know, maybe the solution wouldn't be to move more towards science, which is towards causal description and ontology, right? Rather than toward reason, which risks, I think, being towards, you know, logic and philosophy, right? And I'm not going to go on, I won't go on, I'll really have to restrain myself from going into a long tangent about Marx and Hegel or something like that, but I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
You always want to get your Marx in there. I know. I expect.
Yeah, I would talk about the science of history and causality and stuff like this, but I'll leave the question at that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure I concur with your assessment of like, if I maybe I'm just tired, but like if I understood you correctly, you're saying like that. You're saying you're like science is like the domain of no, the philosophy was the domain of logic and science was the domain of reason. No, what? Just summarize.
Oh, I said like causal redescription and ontology was what I
Right.
associate with.
For science.
Yeah, that's what I attribute to science. Obviously, these are quite general, but
yeah, I think it's maybe it's maybe too general too. I mean, in a sense that like, and it would also be like this disciplinary thing of like, well, where does engineering fit into that universe? Is it science or is it not science? Because in that framing, it wouldn't be. And I don't think there's such a clear distinction. Like I was just sat in a workshop the other week with really nice occasions where it was like really a legit transdisciplinary group, not like here, but like, and the chemist is there and he's like saying, yeah, we're using, you know, these methods to develop materials, to develop drugs, to do all these things, you know. So there's a way that like scientists aren't just like discovering things, they're making things. And so I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding on the part of like non-practicing scientists, like what do they do all day? You know what I mean? And how, because they're also involved in like, they're not just like uncovering or finding out facts about reality, but they have to, I mean, that was the whole point of Margaret Morrison's book, which was fabulous, was like, you know, reconstructing reality. They have to like invent these models. She doesn't like the word fiction, but I'll say it, you know, these fictions in order like basically you need these organons of thought in science now that are constructive in order to access reality. Like her book is about the role of simulation as an empirical as a valid empirical tool in order to discover and prove the Higgs boson at the Hadron Collider, for instance. Like, so you know what I mean? There was like, so there are ways in which that, like, I think, I know you're being simple for the sake of brevity about science, but I think it's like too narrow for my taste.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't want to go on too much. I just meant to elaborate. The way I would say that is I would just say like, and I'm talking specifically about post-Kantian philosophy, not about the entire history of philosophy. So there's the first qualifier. But I mean, I guess, you know, the idea, of course, is that if you do philosophy, you can't start with an assumption. Like Aristotle starts with ontology in the categories, right? You know, that's very different than Descartes or Kant, right? I mean, even Descartes supposes God as sovereign subject, right? But I mean, like the idea is like, if you are a good philosopher, there's this idea that you're not going to start with the assumption of what is. Right? Now, of course, everyone has to do this to some degree or another. So therefore, we can say that the binary is always imperfect, right? But it's like, you know, at the same time, like, I don't think to this degree that scientists sit around being like, you know, not that there aren't epistemological questions in science, like for sure there are, but I don't think scientists sit around to the same degree being like, but does the world exist? Like, is that a real thing? Like, is that like, you know what I mean? So I just mean it in this sense, and I do realize it's more complex. So I agree with you about that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the intervention. Maybe we should take a little break. I feel like I'm fading for a minute, and then we can come back. I mean, we can certainly carry on the conversation, or we can also like talk about the readings. But maybe once get a little like walk around the living room and wake up, then we can take the temperature and you tell me what you want to do, and I will perform for the crowd depending on whatever you like.
Okay, we're back.
There's already a question. No. Hey, Josh.
Already
nice
going to trouble you. But I guess we have what, 2 minutes before everybody's supposed to be back in or something. So.
Yeah, we're just sort of like, it's, you know, I mean, for you guys are more in shape. It's the afternoon or morning. You know, I'm already degenerating.
What time is it there right now? It's got to be like
8. Only 8.
Yeah.
It's not bad. But do you want to wait a bit then to see if more? I don't know if people will put on their cameras or not if they're back, but.
I think you said 104, so I'll give it a minute till after that. But yeah, and it kind of follows up, I guess, a little bit in part, or maybe I might touch on some of the stuff that Conrad was bringing up a little bit. But,
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we lost certain people because, you know, we've been going for 2 hours already, so I'm sure people need to get on with their days or what have you. Well,
it's fortunate I have no life, so.
Well, yeah, we're at like, I think in my neighborhood, something like 1 in 17 people has COVID right now, so I'm not really leaving the house that much either. But yeah, why don't you kick it off? Let us know what's up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, okay. Well, I could start. I mean, you did mention, and I guess I was thinking back because this, and maybe my attention zoned in and out a little bit at points too, but at a certain point in the talk, and I remember this from the Xenofeminist Manifesto, but in this talk you said because the Xenofeminist Manifesto kind of posited the right, and I don't know if this was something that you particularly wrote or other people did, but the right to speak from the position of nowhere. And in this particular talk,
No one in
was it-
particular.
no one in particular. Yes, got it. So, but I mean, I guess you said in this particular talk, there's a, so maybe I am kind of conflating certain sort of concepts, but there is no particular view from nowhere. And I guess I took you to mean to some degree that's suggesting that all particular worlds are sort of historically contingent and conditioned by particular subjects, or that they, yeah, certain subjects contribute to the kind of baking of those worlds. And then I guess the other part of that was the notion of the world kind of, because you start from a very high level of abstraction, a world obviously being a kind of like large scale sort of social construct or social political construct or epistemological construct. I mean, you could make obvious, I guess it seems to me, analogies with the notion of ideology for that matter. And so I guess I was thinking maybe if there are sort of multiple views that are sort of like historically contingent subject, I was thinking about the proletariat as one such sort of historically contingent subject that may have, I guess, yeah, have constructed a type of world or be able to produce a possible world that could be realized at one particular historical moment. And given the sort of notion about, say, sort of adaptable or non-adaptable worlds, the idea that I guess maybe that sort of subject is no longer an adaptable subject, or the kind of worlds that it can create is no longer a sort of adaptable world. I don't know if that, would that track sort of with?
Yeah, I think like, because I think like I mean the concept that's really stuck with me over the years, as you know, because we've known each other for some time, is this kind of problem of the inexistent. So that like, in a sense, like you know, these things that are like, there is like, it's like possibility isn't endless, right? There are material ideal conditions in place that make certain things possible and certain things less less feasible, let's say. So it's not like I think like this, my position on that is partly in response to what I think is a kind of possibility idealism, like the way that in a lot of discourses in the humanities people throw around possibility as if it's infinite, and as if talking about constraints on possibility is like means you're ceding to the status quo or something like that. But I think it actually is like a really important responsibility to look specifically at the configuration of the present to precisely work on how it can leverage otherwise, right? One in logical terms, one of the collaborators who I mentioned early on, that I worked with, introduced this axiom to me, that was called the Barkan formula. So it was like the possibility of A like requires the necessity of the existence of the possibility of A. And that axiom that I learned through him, because he's coming more from the world of, you know, computer science, has a mathematical background as well. I just found that incredibly helpful as a kind of general axiom through which to approach the question of what he was calling realizability. You can also say like possibility, right? So yeah, in terms, and this is like where, you know, hopefully by continually having to reference the given conditions, right? Like to escape the given, you can't, it's not that you can just choose to ignore the given, you have to work with them. That's the whole kind of remaking sort of imperative, if you want, that I think echoes that axiom of the possibility of A, if you want. And so, and then which means like, yeah, having this quite deep analysis of what's available, which also hopefully, but it doesn't happen very often, takes us out of certain dogmatisms around certain thinkers, right? That you see, that as if the conditions, like you said, of the invention and the existence of the proletariat in a certain economic configuration translates one-to-one in our present, as if, and without, and I'm not saying it does, I don't have the tools, I'm not like a political theorist to do that, but I think you can't assume that it adapts one-to-one in a vastly different techno-material geopolitical order, right? That's necessarily going to transform the space of affordance of activity, which isn't to say, it's not to cede to the status quo of this configuration. It's rather to like, what have we got at hand to work with, right?
Yeah, I mean, the proletariat once upon a time being the sort of subject object of history. And I mean, I guess there's the question of, is that still necessarily the case? And I mean, what then is the sort of subject? Because I think you're talking at both sides, at times, both sort of about expanding the subject, it seems to me, so that like the sort of perspective of the human or the world of the human was once this sort of very Eurocentric male type of figure, and now it's also that perspective is shifting out from that center to a larger periphery, but at the same time that sort of opens up new space of possibility for distinct worlds.
Could I just suggest some? Oh, sorry. Continue.
Go ahead, Conrad.
Okay. I don't want to,
Oh, I want to work on this. Please, I know you've got even a class coming up on this question, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like to talk about the proletariat and the relation to the subject, I think something important to keep in mind, and I think like Patricia, when you talk about like we, or like what are we going to do, right? Is that, I think the conception of human universality doesn't really antedate the conception of the proletariat, right? So, it's like, I know in Nigri's like Pensée Descartes or whatever, he talks about how, Descartes' philosophy and, sort of the status of the observer in the context of rationalism, is representative of kind of the development of the bourgeois class. But even that, I mean, you have to ask yourself, well, where does the bourgeois class come from, right? As a generality to that extent, right? There's already a process of proletarianization. In fact, that becomes in a certain way the latent truth of bourgeois culture itself, right? As in a sort of master-slave analysis. But I mean, when historical philosophers, I think, speak, and I'm talking, we go to like ancient Greece or something, like, I think we have a strong tendency, and you could even see it in modernity, but I think we have a strong tendency to think, well, yeah, like they're talking about humans, right? Without regard for the fact that, that sort of, conceptual biological generality didn't exist. And when they use words like we, they're not necessarily referring to such an identity that's so universal. And then even when, philosophers in like the 18th century, very often talk about like we, it's like, did they mean women? Probably not. Right. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is that, and we know, like, of course, I don't, the term subject has its earliest origin within like the hypokeimenon, like in ancient Greece. I mean, it's only with really, I think Heidegger says it's only really in the context of modern Europe that it starts to be like, oh, that's a person, right? It's a philosophical observer. It only acquires that connotation there. So I guess, I think, when we approach this, we have to ask, when we say things like we, right, and when we talk about a changing subject, right, is it possible that the personification of the subject, so to speak, right, because I'm not saying that there wasn't a prefatory conception of substance or something like that, like there's some kind of philosophical antecedent to this, but the personification of the subject, right? I don't necessarily see as older than the proletariat itself. And then if it's capable of changing and expanding, well, in a way, hasn't that been the history of the proletariat? You know, the introduction of women into the workforce, industrialization, which pretty much coincides with the rise of, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft, 1791, writing Vindication of the Rights of Women, right as the French Revolution is going on. You know, so I guess that I think that's just something to keep in mind, that these are also very embedded historical structures too. I'm not trying to make like a polemical point against anyone. I just throw that out there because I think it can help, you know.
No, I don't think it's in any way. I didn't hear it as polemical in the way. I mean, I read it more as like, yeah, this is like a relative. The fact that you even have this kind of invention of humanity, no matter how unfulfilled it was in practice, right? There's a concept that's introduced there that isn't like you can't just assume that it by default existed. But I think even recognizing that, you know, when you look at some of our long-standing institutions, and by long-standing, you know, I'm talking about the bias of a human perspective, so a couple hundred years, right? And when we are literally speaking about a planetary scale, that is a very, very poor time scale to be going by, right? So already we're privileging, I'm like giving my human prejudice and talking about this long scale of a couple hundred years only. But I think this is what I mean. I think it's so important to recognize that certain default concepts that we throw around and think are or structures that we just think that have been completely naturalized, right? They have a historical genealogy. And for me, like part of recognizing, like feeling yourself as a historical creature, which I think is what Winter is trying to get us to do, helps you realize the contingency of the moment, right? That like, and I'm thinking a lot about this in the sense of the naturalization of the nation state as a kind of dominant organizing principle, right? You know, like that is so entrenched as like, there's so many modes of powerful identification that go along with that, right? And it's such a relatively new institution. But the thing that I find compelling about Winter's sort of how I interpret her, the way she sees history functioning, and it's always going to be a little bit insufficient, right? Because she's not even weaving in this like whole Chakrabarti stuff about, you know, history isn't just human. I mean, that's the whole point of this, of climate catastrophe, is like history is no longer of the domain of humans. That was a wrong move since the beginning of the invention of history, if you want. But nonetheless, Winter's asking from a human perspective that you have to see it in this kind of like binocular vision, right? At once hold to the geographic specificity of particular histories, right? Like she talks about like the colonization of Jamaica, for example. It's like a concrete case study, as well as holding the history of the evolution of humanity, which to me, I mean, you're much more on the Marx specialist, but it definitely is not completely divorceable from a species being sort of self-conception, which also, even though she's not in support of a Marxist project, nonetheless, these kind of commitments to some sort of like the ability to self-conceive oneself as part of this, as part of a species, a shared species, and to how thinking human history in this binocular way will, you know, is kind of necessary for this the path dependencies that have got us into this condition that we're in at the moment. And to me, that's quite compelling, because it's also mixing you know, it's the narrative histories, it's the differential histories, it's the different geographies, but then kind of with this bridging object of a species entity that like basically knits it together. But anyways, that's
yeah, it works very interesting. Yeah.
But what did I, Josh, do you want to summarize what you said? Because I think I had an answer and I'm just too flaky to remember what.
I don't know if I'm one of those assholes that probably just didn't really quite have a full question, but just wanted to kind of like stir the shit a little bit. So I don't know that there was like a definitive coherent question there. It was more just, I guess, a question about, or not question, but just like, I'm curious about the way that yeah, these sort of like historical contingency plays into, I guess,
Yeah.
because you've got a very kind of structured perspective, like I said, one that starts from a very high level of abstraction
Mhm.
and then moves down into sort of, I guess, very localized entities like subjects. And maybe those subjects are an entire group of people like the proletariat, or a particularly historicized type of subject like the proletariat. I mean, and maybe those subjects are individuals like artists or something like that. And I mean, I don't know if I have this again as a question, but just thinking about that in the sort of historical placement contingency of those various subjects. I guess I'm wondering how, and maybe this is a question or part of what your structure is meant to think through, how we move from those particular local levels back up to that global scale or to that global structure to have that sort of like impact. And I mean, obviously the as a subject, you know, and object of history, the proletariat is precisely sort of positioned to be one of those sort of world or worlding sort of impacting type of subjects, because it is one that has the purchase, I guess, on the material circumstances of history, in a way that maybe, like, for example, I as an individual artist do not have purchase on history. Like, I as an individual artist cannot expect that whatever act I take doing based on my understanding of worlds or attempting to create new possible worlds will have this sort of global world historical impact that will form a new world that basically other subjects enjoy.
Mhm.
Hey, can I tag team with Josh real quick just to stir the shit?
Yeah.
Because, you know, what we're talking about here is possibility, possible worlds, and of course we love that, right? But you know, in order for this to not slip into some trivialized production of like any world whatsoever, possible world, I mean, I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about possibility. And I think, you know, I'm on board with everything you're saying, Patricia, and I think you would agree with this, that like it is to some degree necessary to just you know, clarify what we mean by possibility, because unfortunately us within the art world, whatever, we're stuck with this discourse on like artists producing possibilities. I mean, I'm thinking of like an Art21 newsletter that I received an email. I click it just to have some like, you know, benign curiosity to see what's going on, and it's, you know, so and so artist is using materials to discover new possibilities. I'm like, are you serious? What, are you a materials scientist? I don't.
Yeah.
This is really what's going on. So I think it's like what what possibilities are we really talking about, right? I mean, this is it can't just be the open horizon of possibility.
Mhm.
This is insufficient. So I just, you know, I want to kind of get your response to that, just to start the shit with Josh.
Yeah, 100%. I'm not sure if you like dipped out for a minute, because we kind of talked about this a little bit in the sense that like is exactly what I was kind of noticing, this kind of you know, both in design and the art field, what I like to think about possibility idealism, right? That like, and as if all possibilities are good possibilities and possibilities worth pursuing, right? So what are the types of constraints on possibility, which obviously is both, you know, material and normative, in the sense of what ought to be done, right? So just to say, I'm not sure if you'd slipped away, but we kind of, I mean, I guess not so explicitly, but definitely addressed that, and was mentioning this like axiom that you know, I was introduced to from a collaborator, which was that the possibility of X necessarily requires the existence of the possibility of X, which means that you cannot speak about possibility, like realizable possibility, let's say, without a very detailed, like, you know, analysis of like what's the situation at hand, basically. And I think that feeds into some of Goodman's things, right? In the sense of like, you know, if every making is a remaking of stuff already at hand, well, then you have to, you have to be able to see what's at hand. Some of it may be obscured because it's, you know, the configuration of a world desensitizes you from seeing it. I mean, there are those problems that arise as well. There could be possibilities that are obfuscated, right? But it's not like, it's not an ideal category alone. Absolutely not. But does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you. Yeah, sorry, I missed when you were going over that previously.
Yeah, but to tie back into Josh, I know, and I say this almost every talk, and I know I just get myself into problems because I think, yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a problem if you're trying to, if you're interested in like big systems and these kind of questions, then there's always so many holes in your thought, and you know them. But you're basically talking about the problem of power. As I, you know, if I had to synthesize what you're saying, it's just like, yeah, okay, none of us here have any, well, I don't know. I'm assuming none of us here, because we're here, at least here on a Saturday night, have that much power to enact. And there are different, like, let's say there's the weighting of activity that is vastly different across different groups or individuals or what have you. And that's something that, you know, I'm very much lacking a kind of adequate theory of power that would be anything beyond like a banal, you know, journalistic kind of like account of like, oh, the wealthy class, they can do all these things, they have all these mobilities, etc. I mean, I think it would need to be much more detailed than that. I mean, I think in terms of that's why I am kind of interested in these like discourses around, you know, how to deal with platform, you know, these kind of platform scale economies and so on and so forth. Like, what do we do with them, right? Like all of these sort of discussions of what ought to be done with these, you know, monolithic entities, the Googles, the meta, or sorry, the alphabets, the metas, the whatever, that have so much infrastructural purchase on guiding everyday behavior, as just one example, not the only one, right? But it's one powerful agent, beyond the banal discourse of like, you know, I want to be paid for my data, or I want data ownership. I don't care about my data. Actually, I love it to be anonymized and in this collective space. I just have a huge problem with that it's, you know, becomes a property, et cetera, that it's being used for data sets, et cetera. You know, like, it's not the fact, it's not that I'm not interested in reapplying the regime of property back upon my data, for example, as is one of the more, I think, trivial responses to what to do with these kinds of economies. But I definitely hear your question. I mean, if anyone has an idea about, if they've heard or if they've been updating their kind of theorizations of power, I'd be very welcome to have, you know, references or resources for anyone else that may want to follow that up. I mean, I don't think
Almost sounds like you don't want to get in on the new coin I'm minting, Patricia.
No. Sorry, no offense. But yeah, if anyone has any resources or has anything to say about that, I'd be so interested, because I feel like that's a missing ingredient in a lot of like the political theories that do engage with technology, because I feel like there's a lot of political theory. I've been in some really interesting seminars, right? Like, but then when it comes to tech, you know, like, well, oh, one is taking away your life, etc. Like, it's not particularly helpful, even though, let's say, the historical analysis can be incredibly profound and really well done when it comes to bringing that knowledge in connection with the affordances and the realities, techno realities today. There's often a caricaturizing of it, and likewise on the tech side, I don't feel like there's enough attention paid to historical struggle and so on, right? There's often,
yeah, I mean,
reinventing the wheel of like, don't build your stupid tunnel, like just fucking have buses, you know, and there's no need to do this. Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I think, yeah, Patricia, it's interesting that, I mean, the I mean, I guess we tend to, especially in these like art writers, focus really heavily on the kind of like technical. And I mean, I guess there is a to Keith's point earlier about like techne and techniques of sort of like social interaction or you know, creating works of art, but also there's a technique or technique, I guess, to social organization. And I mean, I guess organization as a particular sort of technical skill is maybe a little underdeveloped, not just merely the question of platforms, but how you organize sort of social groups.
Just I think there's like Dan is asking about the questions on the chat, but just before that, really quick, I wanted to ask if you could clarify, because maybe I also think you were like you froze for a little time there. I just wanted to know exactly what you were talking about in terms of something that's missing in the contemporary theorization about something relating to, you know, politics and platforms and stuff like that, like
Theory of power.
a theory of power. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Do you know of any? I know because you work in this more on the governmental level. It's just not my
Yeah,
field, and I'd be very.
yeah,
If you
I
have
think
any resources, please.
mhm,
If you feel generous, I'm willing
yeah.
to accept.
I think I'm trying to like build that with a bit of different things. I don't know,
Okay.
like one thing that yeah, but I can try to think of something.
No, it'd be helpful. Yeah. Should we take some questions from the chat then? Does that sound?
Yes, I think we should, and yeah, it's up to you how far back you want to go. But the first one was probably from Carlos, no, from Vidisha, followed by Alex, and then I think Jack.
So, so did you say Alex? The first one? So this one from 718, or sorry, it's I guess we're not on the same
Yes.
time.
Mhm.
But is there some connection with the concept? This one?
Yes, we can start with that one.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question was from Alex Orozco, and it was, is there some connection with the concept of exemplification, which, as I understand, comes from Goodman's and Elgin's idea about thought experiments and art in terms that are both are vehicles for explorations and discovery that at the same time can't be instantiated, can't probe an objective applicability. So artifacts are somehow perfect models as they are. Perhaps, I don't know this. Is Alex there and wants to say? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't see him, so I assume not.
I mean, I don't really know, so I can't really offer any.
Okay, in that case, we can move on to the following question.
Okay, I mean, maybe we should just ask if somebody's here, because it feels a bit weird to because this, I think Jack Segbar's is like more of a comment and elucidation for people. Should I read it out because I think it's helpful?
Yes,
I mean,
please.
sure. So this is from Jack Segbar. So Adorno phrases the space of art as per se resisting the definition of form. Art's position is to reserve the space of non-category. That's what he calls law of form. Can such a notion be an epistemological form for art as that space that mediates other categories and epistemologies? I was triggered by this question of art's epistemology. This differs from Badiou's position, who categorizes art's truth procedures along with the other categories. I mean, I have to do more thinking on this, to be honest. Like, I have not been dedicating the last years of thought on the category of art, if I'm brutally honest. So I think it's an interesting question, but I don't feel capable of answering it because I would like to read these things before before committing to something. But I think, yeah, it's an interesting thing. And when he says, like, can such a notion be an epistemological form for art as that space that mediates other categories and epistemologies? Maybe. I mean, it's certainly if I understood correctly, and I'm not trying to de-abstractify the question, but like in one way that is some kind of affordance that I've always felt art should leverage more is the fact that it doesn't possess really a discipline, right? So there's this kind of almost like the space of which we can congregate here today. So it can be a little bit like disciplinarily promiscuous. So I guess one interesting thing to consider for art is how it can, help to, or if it's interested in like the question of how to transit across these various categories of knowledges in the plural. So I don't know, but I think Jack is not here, so which feels a bit unfair to read his question and not really. So maybe.
It's true. We can definitely move on to the next one.
Well, I think Carlos is here. Carlos, do you want to ask your question? Are you present and feel comfortable to go to at least like put on the audio, or are you want to drop it?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, I am, because we were just looking at your question from a while ago. Sorry about that in the chat. And we just wanted to know if you wanted to engage that question or if you prefer to drop it. What do you want to go for it?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Do you want to?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your very, to me, very enlightening presentation. It is not my field. I studied social anthropology over almost 20 years ago. And right now I'm a writer. I'm working on a complex and complicated novel about the world and the relationship between different kinds of beings. So your presentation has been very useful, as well as these discussions. I guess that my question was a kind of commentary, and yes, in a way, a question too. Like, what would happen if let's say extraterrestrials encountered us, or we encountered them? I'm talking about intelligent or a civilized, an extraterrestrial civilization. So what would happen to us in terms of our social ontologies and or current epistemologies? Like, I guess that there would be a transformation, and what would happen to them? Would there be a transformation to them as well? And I guess this is what has happened in our world in terms of our history, like the encounter conquest of the Spanish conquistadors, European conquistadors in America. Like, America was invented in a way. Europe was invented too. Like when when Europeans get, the Spaniards didn't have a sense of we are Spaniards 500 years ago. And I guess the Spaniards didn't have a sense of this is Europe 500 years ago. So it was, like these type of encounters, clashes, produce, I think, new forms of engaging the world, even though, like the Aztecs were already engaging the world in different ways. And what we call the Castilians were also engaging the world in different ways in which we engage the world right now. And the same thing with the Irish, Russians, people from Israel, Jewish people, etc. So what, I guess, like what I'm trying, it's a question, like how, how our epistemologies and ontologies change all the time through these encounters. And I guess it's a comment, you know, like maybe that question in a way is rhetorical, you know, like because this is something that is happening all the time. You know? And the same thing happens in terms of our encounters with new forms of knowledge, you know, like, for example, the theory of relativity, you know, like that was that was a tremendous paradigm shift in terms of physics. The same thing as Newton's, before Newton's discovery of the law of gravity, and the same thing with quantum physics. You know, like all of these encounters that we have with other historical social beings and historical protagonists, and with other types of knowledge, produce, you know, like new epistemologies and ontologies. And it's not something that has a, you know, like it's not something that is not ending right now, and I don't think it's going to, you know, like it's not going to end in 100 years from now. And you know, like the current historical sociological phenomenon of the pandemic right now, in a way, is transforming us and is engaging us with epistemological questions too. You know, like, for example, I see this, you know, like this moment maybe as one, and I think that this is something that was felt also by European philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century, you know, when they encountered the two great wars of the 20th century. You know, like they said, are we the children of Voltaire and Rousseau, or what? You know, like they thought that you know, like the humanist Enlightenment project either was fake or was coming to an end. And in a way, that is something that I've been feeling right now in terms of, you know, like the existential anxieties produced by this clash of epistemologies, you know, like and forms of power. You know, like should I believe science? Should we believe science? Or should I believe in my right to just to engage the world in whatever way I want to, and challenge these foreign epistemologies and these foreign forms of power, including the state? Sorry for this complex rambling.
No, thank you. Good luck with the writing of your book. Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously like productive ways just to kind of. There's one example that I really like that. I mean, I like it because of course it confirms my predilection towards, you know, the generative force of interference. But like, I think it's not even an anecdote. It's really like it's a it's a disciplinary sort of like fact. It's like, I think the theory of relativity, and I'm gonna paraphrase it, but essentially like the theory of relativity would have been impossible had Einstein the mathematical affordances of his own particular field. And it was only until he was looking at, it could have been chemistry or something, but I may be getting that wrong, but in dialogue with other frameworks from other fields, that he could then find a way to transit into the domain that he was investigating and find all this productive possibility, right? So that to me is so inspiring, of like these responsible forms of transit or of interference that can happen across these fields, right? That aren't that aren't silly, you know. They're not like how, I don't know, when I was in art school in the late 90s, you know, it was all like, oh, chaos is beautiful, and everyone was like, you know, using these terms, but they didn't really understand what it was. We just like Mandelbrot set the way it looked or something, right? So it was a trivial way. So like, what is a non-trivial way to create those you know, liaisons across fields that may allow for some degree of productive transformation, right? Because you also talk about, you know, you address the destructive transformation, of course. So transformation itself is relatively, it's kind of a normatively neutral term. Of course, it happens in productive ways, and also happens in completely destructive ways. But I think like, yeah, in the kind of, I guess, ambition of trying to approach these problems as constructively as possible, I'm kind of holding out for, I guess I'm holding out for that, what types of what ways of thinking can be enabled through those kinds of encounters, that hopefully aren't like, they're not trying to just subsume something into an existing framework, as has been historically the case. And also kind of rewriting certain concepts. Like you know, as much as I'm a defender of reason, I think for that very reason, I don't think that allows you to look at the Enlightenment and disavow some of the real material, concrete, historical consequences of moves made in the name of an Enlightenment ethos. Even if you say it didn't fulfill its promise, it set up ideals, it didn't fulfill them, well, that's a part of its history. So you can't just say, you know, these were the main points, they wrote all this racist shit, but you know, let's keep it. I don't think you get out that easy. You have to acknowledge it, and it doesn't mean that you have to disavow the ideals. But then there's even much more complicated way to say this is like, and I think again, like a figure like Lewis Gordon, who seems to be doing, you know, a fair amount of historical work on, as a defender of reason as well, even if we maybe don't disagree with his distinction of rationality and reason, but nonetheless, like this figure of like, what is it, Zero Jacob, the you know, in nowadays Ethiopia, like retreated into a cave and wrote this treatise, Hatata, I believe it's called. You can't even find it online. There's some obscure scholarship from an Anglo scholar, but the point is like all these, and it's written in like, I don't know, 1630 or something like this. It's like completely much more progressive than what Kant wrote, for instance. Women had rights, you know, like all these things that we say, oh yeah, it was just their time, they didn't get it right. It was like there was people before coming up with these so-called enlightened principles that even had followed through further than what we've taken. And so it's just to say that like I worry about not granting reason a bigger breadth of history than what we tend to narrowly say, oh, the Europeans monopolized. It's like they don't have a monopoly on it. And actually, we kind of impoverish ourselves by not looking to these histories and building a more robust genealogy, including the failures, right? Like, there's some wonderful anecdotes about the, you know, Italian Jesuits arriving in China with this new invention of perspectivalism, right? Classical perspectivalism. And then the Chinese reportedly like thought, okay, it was impressive technically, but they were like, why on earth would you draw from the perspective of a single person? This makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense, right? Like that desire to represent reality from a single vantage point just made no sense at all. And so there are moments where there are these, where you get a clearer picture of the sort of axiological condition of different worlds when they also come into conflict, right? Something that as a Western subject, I never really thought about. I'm like, yeah, you know, grew up in a long-standing liberalist tradition. I'm an individual and my perspective matters, blah, blah, blah. and in other worlds, it's just completely doesn't even make sense to approach reality in that way. So I don't know. That's why I'm interested in those, like again, in all of in the longer history and the wider history of these things, in order that we can build up a more, I think, a more accurate account of what's going on, and also accountability to certain claims and recognizing the abuses of done in reason's name, for instance, right? Because of course it's responsible for possessing the reason to decide upon who does not possess reason. So pretty big mistake.
May I just like, I think I have a question which is pretty much like the same question, I guess, that Carlos, at least the way I understood it, but that I wanted to put it in more like, I don't know, more in how I see like the kind of philosophical terms, like in your own work, or also like in JP Cajon's work, for example. This is a question that I've had for a while, which is like, you know, in this interface that appears between like the world as a kind of epistemological framework of categories that's kind of intensive, and then like the form of life or the way of inhabitation that's like the implementation of the world, and then that's extensive, and then you have like an interplay between those things, right? And it seems to me that depending on how you see the relation between those two like levels of the same, the question of the encounter between worlds might appear differently, right? In the sense that if there's a dimension of the world which is this inhabitable interface with a reality, which is like external, and if we're not going to be perspectivist in a bad sense, right, which is something that even Viveros de Castro says he doesn't believe in, that like perspectivism in the sense that there's no reality which conditions the perspectives, right? That's like the point of putting it in ontological or in metaphysical terms rather than purely epistemological perspectivism, right? Because if you don't see the separation between the intellectual world and the form of life or the mode of inhabitation, or what in perspectivism you might call a body, which accompanies it somehow, then the encounter between worlds is, it would maybe establish a kind of transitional zone between worlds, right? Because if you see those two parts as two separate, then you could say that there are kind of noises that might, or frictions that might come up with the co-inhabitation of the form of life, but then that will only appear as a kind of non-correspondence from the point of view of the intellectually modeled world. But then if you see those things as more integrated, and that would depend, I guess, on the like philosophical ontological status that you give to those things, then you might think that the world as intellectual construction might have a transition zone with other worlds, right? And that's I think part of what I think is attractive about perspectivism in the sense of the ontological turn, is it's that the encounter with a different world isn't just something that you can't account for, and then you have to remodel your conceptions, but it's actually a transition zone. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear. You know, I'm not a technical philosopher either, but yeah, I just wanted to know how you think about those things, because that's always a question that appears to me talking, like discussing with those different positions in the same like life forming, world making discussion that we're having.
Yeah, because I think like I haven't been thinking about it in your terms, but I guess I've been thinking about it more in like the temporal terms, in the sense of like worlds ending and worlds, you know, beginning and so on. So like because that basically the reason I bring that in is not to avoid your question, but it's just to say I think it's a question of like thresholds of proximity, and like what is it between worlds? Do they overlap? Like, is it a uniform case? Like, if you had to diagram it, like what does that look like, right? So it is interesting, this kind of, so if I understood you correctly, like the encounter of worlds is already a transitory zone, let's say, for
Yeah, like would you see like worlds, maybe like worlds in the strict sense, like in the not necessarily inhabitable or inhabited sense, because in the sense that I don't remember like the exact terms that you used for what I understood that way, but whether you see worlds as having like gradual transitions between them, or are you either inside your world or at the other, or you have another perspective with another corresponding world, or do worlds sort of interpenetrate?
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, just intuitively, it would seem like you couldn't make an axiom for that. Like, there's a specificity to your question that I think, okay, so what worlds are you talking about? Like, is it possible to generalize that? That is it possible to give a sufficient answer at the level of the general? I would have doubts about that, because I think this, like, if you're talking about worlds, you're giving some specificity, right? We're not talking about, because in order for it to be a world, it would have to be, have that self-referential structure, have its inner coherence, if you want, blah blah blah. So that means like it would be distinguishable. The point is, like, worlds are distinguishable from other worlds, and geographically, but also historically. So the question is, like, yeah, in that way, because it would be specific, I don't think you could have that general axiom to say, well, yes, all worlds will bleed in, or no, there's a rupture and there's this. I don't know. I don't think that there's, I wouldn't see it as a universal picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, but then it's like you mentioned the temporality thing, and that's also something that I was wondering about in terms of like, if you talk about worlds, like the transitions between them in terms of succeeding each other, or of having this line of futurity, which is eventually disrupted, and then you have a succession, then wouldn't you have to have a kind of timeline that's extra world? Like, that's something that also like raised the question for me, because then I would think that this kind of temporality, and I think in the way you're saying that also, like this kind of futurity, like this line of futurity, is internal to a world configuration. So in those terms, you wouldn't have like a trans-worldly line in which those things would necessarily succeed. You would like, and I was thinking even like, for example, I remember seeing Daniel Mundukuru, which is an indigenous thinker from Brazil, saying that in his worldview, there's no concept of future. There's only the present and the past. And I think like even in Western terms, it's often argued, like even classically, I think that the idea of future that we work with is kind of specific to modernity, and that you would have a circular time before that, which is not exactly before that, because precisely that depends on the framework, right? So then if you would have an effective difference between worlds or world transition, then the temporality of that would seem like something that would have to be more complicated than a succession, right?
I would agree, yeah, because I think like that was also part of this idea, like, yeah, that like basically worlds prescribe a mode of futurity that allows them to change while remaining within their world. You know what I mean? While remaining recognizably, just like how, like I said, you know, we're still in the same historical world as, like, you know, 50 years ago, even though there's been substantial changes. But I would just argue that I think, like, the primary reference points for making decision for this and that, like, these are more or less forming a cohesive structure, like a recognizable structure that gives it continuity. And yeah, I agree. I think obviously there's been loads written about modernity's particular version of the future. I think, like, yeah, and then there's many other you know, cosmological pictures of time, right? That's like one of the helpful definitions of you know, the cosmological, to kind of bring it out of, sometimes it gets thrown around in this a bit esoteric way. And I really appreciated when this scholar Bentley Allen just gave a 5-point, he's like, cosmology is composed of epistemology, ontology, cosmogony, temporality, and destiny. But the point is, like, cosmologies possess a structure of time endemic to them, right? Because in a way, I mean, it may be sloppy, it may arguably be sloppy scholarship on my part, but I mean, I kind of see this cosmology world a bit interchangeably, if I'm honest. You know, it's the set of parameters. It's like how you want to label it, but for me, they're very much, I don't know how I would distinguish them, to be very honest. So, but yeah, that, whoa, it's like a huge storm coming right now. That's why I keep looking outside. But yeah, there's definitely different structures of time, right? And so, and that's, I think that's a really interesting, it's a really interesting problem space for the questions of this planetary site or space, spatiality. So it's like weird stuff happening either in my neighbors or there's some wind, but I don't know. Because yeah, we're not talking about human temporality now, no matter how diverse that's been, right? It has been a diverse assortment of visions of what time is and what it means and so on and so forth. But we're dealing with all of these laminated time scales together now. And that's really like a huge conceptual a problem of how to be able to think or uphold all of those things. Yeah, this is the, but I think it's definitely one of those, it's definitely a criteria for upholding this multiplicity or the plurality without it becoming like mere relativism. Why? Because it's actually a more accurate depiction of reality to have that plurality rather than just like seceding. Do you know what I mean? But anyways. But yeah, I'm kind of fading a little bit because it's been like 3 hours.
That makes sense. Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Like,
It's been three full hours, 3 very productive hours.
yeah. I hope I live. There's some weird stuff happening in my house. People are losing it with Corona. I think they're having some kind of weird party or something. Anyways, but yeah, I have to thank you so much for your engagement. It was really, I'm really appreciative of all the comments and everyone who took the time to listen in, and hopefully it was useful for your thinking.